In 1881, a photograph was taken that should never have existed. It was not merely improper, it was explosive, a quiet piece of paper that carried the power to ruin a monarchy. In the picture, a young Hungarian actor named Joseph Kainz sits casually in an ornate chair, while beside him stands Ludwig II, King of Bavaria. In royal protocol, such a scene was unthinkable. Kings did not stand before commoners, let alone actors, who sat beneath them. Yet here was a sovereign, one of Europe's most powerful rulers, standing like a servant beside a man who should have been invisible in the grand order of nobility. The photograph was more than a breach of etiquette. It was a revelation, a glimpse into something Ludwig had hidden for nearly 2 decades. When copies reached Munich, ministers immediately understood what they were seeing. This was not simply a portrait, it was evidence. Evidence of a relationship that could never be spoken aloud in 19th century Bavaria. From that moment, a chain of events was set in motion that would unravel Ludwig's carefully built world of secrecy and shadows. That single photograph would mark the beginning of a conspiracy, one that would end not in court nor in exile, but in blood and water. The 13th of June, 1886, Lake Starnberg, Bavaria. The rain had cleared, leaving the air heavy and still. Villagers would later recall how the evening seemed to hold its breath. At 10:30 p.m., 2 bodies floated in waist-deep water, not far from shore. One was Dr. Bernhard von Guden, Bavaria's most respected psychiatrist, his face scratched, his neck bearing the unmistakable signs of strangulation. The other was Ludwig II, King of Bavaria, 40 years old. His watch stopped at 6:54 p.m. The official verdict arrived within hours: suicide by drowning. But the story crumbled the moment it was examined. Ludwig had been a strong swimmer since youth, known for his stamina in the icy waters of Bavarian lakes. No water was found in his lungs. His body showed no signs of exhaustion or panic. The official narrative demanded that people believe a man who could swim across lakes had somehow drowned in water barely reaching his chest. Rumours ignited immediately. Some claimed Ludwig's coat mysteriously vanished after the autopsy had 2 bullet holes in the back. Others pointed to the fisherman who discovered the bodies, Jakob Liedl, a man who received suspicious payments for the rest of his life and quietly rose to become mayor of his village. In his private papers, found after his death, Liedl confessed that he had been prepared to help the king escape that night, that he had even brought a boat. But then, as Ludwig waded towards him, a gunshot rang out across the dark lake. The king collapsed face forward into the water. Liedl was told if he valued his family's lives, he had seen nothing but 2 drowned men. Why would the Bavarian state declare the death a suicide when evidence screamed otherwise? Why pay for the silence of a fisherman? Why destroy or conceal key pieces of evidence? The truth may lie in documents that remain sealed to this day. More than a century later, the Bavarian government still refuses to release its files on Ludwig's final hours, calling them too sensitive. But what is so dangerous, even now, about the death of a king? Perhaps the answer is that Ludwig was not merely a monarch undone by eccentricity. He was something far more threatening to the political world of 19th century Europe, a man who had built an alternate kingdom in the shadows, a realm of secrecy, desire, and forbidden love. By day, he was a dutiful king, cloaked in protocol and expectation. By night, he lived another life, one hidden from ministers, priests, and the public gaze. To understand why Ludwig II ended up face down in Lake Starnberg, why a respected doctor was strangled beside him, and why silence was bought at such a high price, we must return to the beginning, to the moment when a young Bavarian prince first discovered a truth about himself that could never be spoken. Munich, 1863. Bavaria's capital was alive with courtly splendour, a city where candlelight flickered against gilded walls and ministers whispered about the future of their young crown prince. Ludwig, just 18 years old, carried himself with the poise of royalty, tall, striking, and already the subject of fascination among his people. Yet behind the polished veneer, he was a boy standing on the threshold of a destiny he could neither shape nor escape. That year, Ludwig met the man who would alter the course of his life. Prince Paul von Thurn und Taxis arrived at court in the glittering uniform of an aide-de-camp. His golden buttons gleamed, his posture was flawless, and when his eyes met Ludwig's across the throne room, the world seemed to hold its breath. Ludwig had seen handsome men before Munich's court was filled with polished nobles, but Paul was different. There was an electricity between them, dangerous, nameless, but undeniable. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Their public correspondence was polite, full of duty and honour, but hidden in the archives were other letters, written in hurried script and guarded like holy relics. "Dear and beloved Ludwig," Paul confessed in one, "my heart beats only for you. I am consecrated to you, body and soul." Ludwig's reply carried a desperation that bordered on fever. "You are the sun in my darkness. Without you, I pace my chambers like a caged animal." In 19th century Bavaria, these words were more than dangerous, they were fatal if discovered. The court was a hive of ears and eyes, servants whispering, ministers watching. Within 6 months, rumours bled into Munich's taverns. The prince, it was said, preferred the company of his aide-de-camp over any princess paraded before him. Something had to be done. Ludwig's mother, Queen Marie, acted swiftly. She summoned Paul to a private audience. No record survives of what was spoken that night, but Paul left Bavaria immediately, reassigned to Prussia, never to return. Ludwig was shattered. His first taste of love had ended in exile and silence. Worse, it taught him a lesson he would never forget. For him, love could only mean loss. Grief consumed him, and in that grief, something shifted. At first, ministers noticed only small changes. The young prince missed morning councils, arrived late to afternoon meetings. But soon the pattern grew undeniable. Ludwig rarely appeared before sunset. By winter, courtiers whispered that he had developed an aversion to daylight itself. They assumed it was morning. In truth, it was discovery. Ludwig had realized that the night gave him freedom the day would never allow. In darkness, he could remove the mask of the dutiful heir, if only for a few hours. Then, in 1864, the mask became a crown. King Maximilian II, Ludwig's father, died suddenly, and at just 18, Ludwig ascended to the throne. The crown weighed 3.5 pounds, but to Ludwig, it felt like iron pressing down on his soul. He was no longer simply a prince who could hide in shadows. He was king. Bavaria expected him to marry, to father heirs, to continue a dynasty stretching back 7 centuries. But Ludwig knew the truth. He could never do it. They tried, of course. In 1867, hope filled the court when Ludwig announced his engagement to Princess Sophie, the sister of Austria's Empress Elizabeth Sisi, the glittering star of Europe. Sophie was everything a queen should be, refined, intelligent, gracious. The wedding date was set for Ludwig's birthday, the 25th of August. Invitations were dispatched across Europe. Bavaria prepared for celebration. But behind closed doors, Ludwig unravelled. He postponed the wedding once, then again. He became erratic, restless, consumed by a dread he could not confess. In October, he summoned Sophie privately. According to her memoirs, he looked pale, almost broken. "I cannot do this to you," he told her. "You deserve a husband who can love you completely. I am not that man. I will never be that man." The engagement collapsed. Astonishingly, Sophie bore no anger. She never married anyone else, later claiming, "How could I after being loved by Ludwig?" But she was mistaken. Ludwig had not loved her. His heart already belonged to another. By then, the young king was spiralling deeper into his double life. By daylight, he was Bavaria's monarch, bound by ceremony and obligation. By night, he was something else entirely, a man searching for connection in the only hours where society slept. It was this hunger for intimacy, this refusal to surrender to the daylight world, that marked the birth of what history would later call the Night King. After the broken engagement, Ludwig seemed lost. The ministers sighed with frustration, the court gossiped, and the people began to wonder if their young king would ever fulfill his duty. But in 1866, in the quiet stables of the royal palace, Ludwig found what he had been searching for. His name was Richard Hornig. A groom of modest birth, Hornig had none of the noble pedigree that court demanded, but he possessed something far more dangerous: loyalty without judgment. Their first encounters were innocent shared rides through the Bavarian countryside, late-night conversations in the stables, but soon their bond deepened into something that neither dared to name aloud. For the first time since Paul von Thurn and Taxis, Ludwig felt whole again. Yet joy was never simple for him. The young king was devoutly Catholic, and every embrace with Hornig filled him with both ecstasy and torment. His diaries from these years bleed with contradictions. "I am damned, yet alive," he wrote in one entry. In another, "Forgive me, Lord, that I cannot destroy this desire, for it is stronger than prayer, stronger than fear." It was during this period that Ludwig made one of his most extraordinary decisions: the construction of Neuschwanstein Castle. On paper, it was presented to the government as a monument to Bavaria's medieval heritage, a shrine to the legends of Lohengrin and Parsifal, Wagner's operas made stone. But the truth was different. Neuschwanstein was not a castle for the people. It was a fortress of privacy, a refuge where Ludwig could live as he pleased, far from the eyes of Munich's ministers. Hidden staircases, secret passages, balconies overlooking untouchable landscapes, every detail was designed to separate the king from the world that chained him. At the same time, Ludwig's life grew stranger. His rejection of daylight became absolute. He slept through councils, signed documents by candlelight, and often summoned his servants at midnight to begin his day. As the city awoke, their king was going to bed. The people called him the Night King. But Ludwig was not merely escaping, he was creating. By night, he assembled a secret circle of companions, actors, musicians, loyal servants, and trusted lovers. Together they formed what could only be called a shadow kingdom, an inverted court where roles were reversed, and Ludwig finally was free. The centerpiece of this hidden world was the Venus Grotto, a man-made cavern constructed in the gardens of Linderhof Palace. On the surface, it seemed like a whimsical folly, inspired by Wagner's opera Tannhäuser, but step inside, and one entered another reality. The grotto glowed with colours produced by cutting-edge electrical lighting technology that few in the world had yet seen. A lake shimmered in the middle, complete with a gilded shell-shaped boat where Ludwig would recline, dressed as the Swan Knight, while private performances unfolded before him. The grotto was more than theatre, it was sanctuary. No ministers, no protocols, no judging eyes. Just Ludwig, his chosen companions, and a dream of love unshackled from law and tradition. Still, even within this dream world, shadows lingered. Ludwig knew the ministers whispered about his debts, his absences, his obsessions with castles and midnight performances. They dismissed his vision as madness. They feared his extravagance would bankrupt Bavaria. But Ludwig also knew something they did not. He could not stop. To abandon his castles and his secret world would mean surrendering the only life that felt true. And Ludwig II of Bavaria had never been a man willing to surrender. By the early 1882, however, fate introduced a new player into Ludwig's life, one whose arrival would tip the fragile balance of the Shadow Kingdom into open danger. In 1881, Ludwig's restless heart found a new object of devotion. His name was Joseph Kainz, a 22-year-old Austrian stage actor whose performances in Munich had already caused a sensation. Kainz was magnetic, his voice carried like thunder, his beauty disarmed even the harshest critics, and his presence on stage seemed almost supernatural. When Ludwig saw him perform, he was transfixed. Unlike the ministers or nobles who surrounded him daily, Kainz belonged to a different world, one of passion, art, and freedom. The king invited him to private audiences, where they read poetry together, rehearsed dramatic scenes, and exchanged gifts that blurred the line between patronage and intimacy. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and utterly reckless. Soon, Ludwig insisted that Kainz accompany him on a private trip to Switzerland. Travelling under false names, the king and the actor disappeared into the mountains, where courtiers and servants later whispered they lived not as monarch and subject, but as equals, perhaps even as lovers. But it was there, in the midst of this dreamlike escape, that disaster struck. A single photograph was taken of them, an image that should never have existed. The photograph was innocent by modern standards, the king seated beside the young actor, their shoulders almost touching. But for 19th century Bavaria, it was a time bomb. A king did not sit beside a common actor as though they were equals. And more than that, the photo carried an unspoken truth, visible in their eyes, the truth of intimacy. The image found its way back to Munich, and whispers turned into shouts. Ministers who had long suspected Ludwig's nature finally had proof. The rumours of Paul, of Hornig, of the midnight rides and grotto performances, all of it suddenly gained flesh in one forbidden picture. At first, the government tried to bury it. To expose a king in this way would be to destabilise the monarchy itself. But Count Maximilian von Hohenstein, Ludwig's most dangerous enemy and a former childhood friend, saw an opportunity. He gathered every scrap of evidence he could: testimonies from dismissed servants, notes passed between Ludwig and Kynes, lavish gifts exchanged in secret. The king's love life alone was not enough to dethrone him. Bavaria could tolerate eccentricity, even scandal, as long as Ludwig maintained his crown. But Hohenstein realized something far more effective. If Ludwig could be proven insane, he could be legally removed. And so, the campaign began. Ministers whispered of the king's nocturnal habits, his obsession with Wagner, his castles built at impossible expense. They painted him as unhinged, detached from reality, a man consumed by fantasies and unfit to rule. In 1886, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, a psychiatrist eager for royal favour, was brought into the conspiracy. Without ever examining the king directly, Gudden signed a damning medical report declaring Ludwig insane. The evidence? His debts, his castles, his love of solitude and, unspoken but understood, his forbidden desires. The verdict was sealed. Bavaria would depose its king. Ludwig, the dreamer who had built a shadow kingdom of love and beauty in the night, had become too dangerous for the daylight world. And so, the stage was set for betrayal. June 1886. The Night King's world was collapsing. On the 10th of June, Ludwig was declared insane and stripped of his crown. Armed guards surrounded Neuschwanstein, his dream castle, to arrest him. But the king, furious and unbroken, refused to leave. "You are traitors," he roared at the ministers. "I will not surrender to you." The standoff lasted 2 days until Hohenstein's men finally forced their way inside. Dragged from his sanctuary, Ludwig was brought under guard to Berg Castle, a lakeside fortress that now became his prison. His keeper was none other than Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, the man who had declared him insane without ever examining him face to face. For 2 days, Ludwig and Gudden circled each other in silence. The king, stripped of power, seemed calm, too calm. On the evening of the 13th of June, Gudden suggested a walk along the shores of Lake Starnberg. The guards were dismissed. Just the king and his doctor set out into the twilight. They never returned alive. Hours later, searchers found 2 bodies floating in the shallow water. Ludwig lay face up, his eyes open to the stormy sky. Beside him, Gudden's corpse bore signs of violence, scratches across his face, bruises on his neck. The official report was swift and convenient. The king had drowned, taking the doctor down with him. But almost immediately the story unravelled. Witnesses who examined the body swore there was no water in Ludwig's lungs, he had not drowned. Others whispered of bullet wounds concealed beneath his coat, though the report was buried. A fisherman later claimed he had seen Ludwig struggling in the water, calling for help, before soldiers dragged him back into the lake, yet his testimony vanished from the record. The truth was smothered in silence. Documents were burned, servants disappeared, even Richard Hornig, Ludwig's loyal companion, slipped into exile, never to be heard from again. Bavaria had decided their king would be remembered as mad, not martyred. And yet, history could not be so easily rewritten. The irony of Ludwig's fate was cruel. The castles that ruined his reign, Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, were ridiculed as monuments to delusion. But after his death they became Bavaria's greatest treasures, drawing millions from around the world. The king who was accused of bankrupting his nation instead made it rich beyond imagination. Even more enduring was his legend. For decades, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Ludwig's cousin and confidant, wore black on the 13th of June in mourning. She once whispered, "The world called him mad, But perhaps it was the world that was mad and Ludwig who was sane. Today, tourists wander his castles and marvel at their beauty, unaware that every gilded wall and painted ceiling hides a secret. They were built not for grandeur, but for privacy. They were walls against a hostile world, sanctuaries for forbidden love. Ludwig II of Bavaria died branded a lunatic, but in truth he was something far more dangerous. A king who chose to live and love by the dictates of his heart, no matter the cost. And in the end, that was the one crime his enemies could never forgive.